he's the one that that scholars will admit that he might not have existed. So like he's just barely above 50% on historicity. So we can count him as historical, but it's weak. Like he's challengeable.
Thank you, everybody who's a patron of MythVision asking your question. This is your video. How's it feel? I know you like it, huh? I like it too. So, Dr. Richard Carrier, thank you for hanging out in the studio.
Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, look, man, I'm not gonna lie. We need to get right into the deep.
Yeah, let's do it.
Fair warning: if you don't have floaties and you don't know how to swim, you're in the wrong video. This Rank-Raglan. Okay, maybe you can paint a little picture here for someone who might be like, rank who? What the heck? I know that that's difficult, especially since we're going into the deep end. But what you have done in a nutshell for dummies like me to express what I feel you're saying is that there's been scholars who have recognized in folklore, legend, mythology, and they've like looked at these different people that fit in categories, patterns, right?
Yeah, they found a repeating genre. You call it a micro-genre of this, the tragic hero king storyline.
Right. And Jesus fits the hell in, okay?
Yeah.
He's a hell of a king in this whole thing. He's all over this thing. And so you're looking for characters, people within literature that are worldwide that really Jesus also matches. And in doing so, you can kind of see how fictive this person is because he matches in the genre. Where we get screwed up as humans is people also that are real historical people get some of these checks of this genre. And it's like, yo, don't you wish everyone just kept the genre completely untainted and historical people stayed here? But we have a problem. And so you were challenged, if you will, by McGregor. Camille Gregor. McGregor, here I am. UFC.
It's not McGruber.
It's that guy, you know.
Yeah.
But Camille Gregor and Chrissy Hansen, and they brought sharp critiques. And as you say, they brought in the correct approach is trying to put more people in the puzzle because then that'll skew the numbers and the prior probability that he existed. The math will check out. Warning, we will be getting into math, but at the end of the video, so stay tuned. We're not going to do that to you during the video for those who have the cojones to endure toward the end.
Yeah. So the math is really easy though, so it's not a big deal. But so let's start from the beginning. So the goal to try and figure out what the prior probability of someone like Jesus being historical is to look at heavily mythologized people and say, how often are those people historical? Because some of them are, right? So the question is, like, if you take like the person who just has mundane historical stories told about them, they're not mythologized at all. And then you have someone who's heavily mythologized. The people that are heavily mythologized are going to tend more often to be mythical, right? So like it's basically heavy mythologization is kind of like a signal of a mythical person, but it's not a guarantee. It's not 100%, right? But it does mean that like if you're heavily mythologized, you're going to be more likely to be. And so like if you're to take, there are all these people that fit into this particular, the Rank-Raglan class. So I use the Rank-Raglan class because it has a lot of members and it's hard to belong because you have to hit a lot of criteria to be in there. So it's difficult to be in there by accident. And there's enough people that you can get something statistically useful out of it. Right. So that's the reason why I use that class, but it's only a proxy to the whole broader class of heavily mythologized people generally. So it's not really matters that they're Rank-Raglan mythology, it's heavy mythology. Rank-Raglan is a particular type of heavy mythologization, and whatever the rate of historicity in that set is probably going to be the same in all other heavy mythologized sets, like other things, right?
If I just while we're diving in, because you're laying out the framework.
Yeah,
it was J-Man 158 who wanted to directly ask you about this, which this is before our live stream when we brought this.
Yeah, we have people want to go back to that live stream, rewatch that archive, because we really went into this. And
for sure. But J-Man 158, thank you for being a patron. Question for Dr. Carrier, and it is in this vein, right? What do you make of claims by Camille Gregor and others that 33 historical persons fit the Rank-Raglan mythotype like Jesus? And that's, I know I should have asked this earlier, but it's kind of like, we're getting into it now.
Yeah.
So thank you. This is your video, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, we don't have to get into the math on that, to just point out that what they did is they dropped the heavy mythologization requirement, which was fundamental to in my study, right? and just did mere mythologization. And so they basically roped in a bunch of people who were just mildly mythologized, not heavily mythologized. Now, when you do that, you expect the result. There's a lot more historical people who are going to pop into the set. But I'm not looking at mundane people, because Jesus is not a mundane person. He's actually he only exists in heavy mythologized contexts. There are no mundane narratives about Jesus. They're all super mythologized. They're all Rank-Raglan set stuff. So what you want to look at is there are people who are in the heavy mythologized set. And so I can't remember how many exactly, but like there's 30 or so extra people that they throw in don't belong in the set. That's actually incorrect. But what they did do that convinced me, and this is important because it comes out in my book, in the new book, The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus, they did convince me that I was wrong in the original study to exclude Alexander the Great, Apollonius of Tyana, and Mithradates of Pontus. So they do find 3 more than I did.
May I walk with you here?
Yeah.
Because I want to make sure I'm tracking. So out of 33 people, they're adding.
Yeah, I can't remember if it's 33 and including these 3 guys, or 33 plus I can't remember what.
But you went in and checked all of them and ultimately walked away saying, look, they're wrong.
Yeah,
These are my.
He doesn't belong. He doesn't belong. He doesn't belong. Like,
But they belong. Bodies did, and you believe.
Yeah, those meet the high mythologization requirements, right? And so they actually meet the requirements. And I have to say this is the Gregor study. There's 2 actually, but this one that we're talking about now is the first time that anyone actually took seriously the prior probability argument, right? And actually did the only thing that you can actually correctly do is to say, like, well, what I did is originally, so in the original study, there's 14 of these people. Jesus is a 15th. So we take the 14 and we ask how many of them are historical, right? And that gives us a rough estimate of how often. So if you throw Jesus in the hat, shake the hat, and you pull someone out at random,
right,
what is the probability they'll be a historical person, right? So it can't be distinctive. Like if Jesus is special, then that's what evidence would tell you, right? So like you could find evidence that you could pull Jesus out and say it's only 1 in 3 chance he's historical, but then you could have evidence that completely flips that and makes him super historical, which would happen with Alexander the Great. You'd shake the hat, you'd pull him out, and you'd be starting because it'd be random chance, 1 in 3 chance that he's a historical person. But then you go look at all the evidence for Alexander the Great, and it wildly throws it up just close behind.
Alexander, one example, because I don't know much about Mithradates. I mean, I know a little, but not much. And I know more about Apollonius of Tyana, and he kind of is closer, in my opinion.
That's a whole other question.
Well, yeah, I think this is important in the weeds, not to get lost. This is important in here. Alexander the Great, if I'm not mistaken, there is mythic literature, and then we have more mundane historical data about this guy, whereas all we have is fan fiction from Jesus. We don't have the other side, or someone who's a little bit going, look, we know the amazing stories of the miracles, but let me tell you about the guy and what he did on Thursday at this time.
Yeah, so that doesn't affect the prior probability that we're talking about now. This is the probability before we look at evidence.
Okay.
Right, so before we look at anything specific.
Generally.
Yeah, like if we pull Alexander out and we know nothing about Alexander, right? We say, what is the probability this guy's historical? Just based on the hat. That's all we're talking. We're talking about all the other evidence, the background evidence. Then you can go look at the evidence for Alexander, and it can change the probability, that's how that works. So that's how you can pull Alexander out. You could start with a low 1 in 3 chance he's historical, but then you look at all the clay tablets and all of the documents and like all that stuff. The probability goes way up, right? Like to 100% practically.
And other sources that talk about
exactly, yeah. So and you would do the same thing with Jesus. So if you pull Jesus out 1 in 3, because he has the same probability as everybody else in the hat, because he's in the same set, right? You pull Jesus out, it's the same probability. But what if there's all this, like, you have the direct eyewitness memoirs of Gamaliel, right? And it just tells, okay, yeah, like you would have a mundane source just like Alexander or Pontius Pilate or anything like that. Then the 1 in 3 goes way up to like, 2 and 3, 4 and 5, 9 and 10 or whatever. Like it would go up because of the evidence, right?
Got it.
So we're only talking about when you pull them out of the hat and you know nothing about them other than that they're a Rank-Raglan hero.
Okay.
So that's what we're talking, and correctly, like the Gregor paper acknowledges this, that we're only doing this. We're not actually talking about, like, this is not resolving the answer of whether Jesus existed or not. Like that, we're not even talking about that. We're just talking about the prior probability of someone this heavily mythologized being historical or not. And that is not the final answer to whether Jesus existed or not. So even if we had tons of really great evidence Jesus existed, he would still have the 1 in 3 prior odds of existing, right? Or 1 to 2, as they would say, prior odds. But so anyway, that's what we're doing with this, right? And Gregor, that team, they actually recognize this and are doing it correctly. And so the idea is, so what I do is I found 14. I excluded these 3 guys because I had reasons that I said, I don't think they belong on a set. Here's why. But so I left it at 14, and Jesus is a 15th. And so you look at the 14 I had, none of them are historical, right? We have no reason to believe any of them are historical. So the rate is 0 at that point, right? But that's how I take that as my lower margin of error. So you've got the low margin of error, upper margin of error. And when you do that, what you're mapping is your uncertainty, right? You're framing your uncertainty. And so when I give a lower bound and an upper bound of my margin of error, what I'm saying is that I do not know what the rate is other than that it is in between those two values. So I can't say it's the bottom value. I can't say it's a top value. I can't say it's a value halfway. I can't say it's a value 2/3 in. Every value between those two values has the same chance of being correct. So I'm basically saying this is the range of my ignorance. Like I can't be any more precise than this. We're as vague as a third of the entire probability space, which is pretty, like that's a wide margin of error, right? So that's what we're doing, the lower bound and the upper bound. I'm not saying the lower bound is correct, and I'm not saying the upper bound is correct. I'm saying it has to be in there somewhere. But usually when someone wants to know, like, what are the odds Jesus existed, they're really asking about the upper bound, right? They're saying, what is the highest that the odds could be, like reasonably be given the evidence? They're usually asking that. They're usually not asking the low end. They're asking the high end. So I usually talk about the high end only. That's usually when I get to the 1 and 3, I'm talking about the high end because that's what most people want to know.
Yeah.
Like they say, like, it can't be higher than that. I'm saying it can't be higher than that, or it's extremely unlikely that it would be higher than that. I'm also saying it's extremely unlikely it would be lower than the lower bound too, but no one cares about that, right? No one really is interested in how low could it be, right? What is the lowest probability? That's not what they ask. They always ask, what is the highest? What's the best odds on Jesus? So we're talking about the top. So that's the important thing. So we're building the range. So what I did is look at the 14. So my lower range is, I don't see any historical people in there. So that's 0 out of 14, right? So people who know any arithmetic go, you can't divide 14 into 0. And wait for the end of this video and we'll get to how that works. But it's 0 out of 14, right? So I have to set my upper margin,
and just so we're on the same page,
yeah,
that they saw that,
yeah,
and they're right, and they questioned the list you provided. To the way they kind of painted it when we talked is that they were like very scholarly about it, but it was kind of like, yeah, he's, of course, factoring in all these non-existent people in order to come to the conclusion that there's non-existent people, that for Jesus is non-existent. Almost like you're doing this intentionally.
You're right. Like, yeah, they don't say that in the paper. I don't.
Yeah, no, but it kind of sounds like you're doing.
Yeah. I'm not though, right? Like the set is set by other scholars and was not designed to contain only mythical people. It just happens to, right?
Yeah.
So what I do on the upper bound is say, well, how many of them could be historical and we just don't know it, right? Like what's the most that would be reasonable to believe possible? Like to say a higher number would be ridiculous. And I come up with 4. And if you want to know, like in the original study on the historicity of Jesus, I explain how I get to 4. It's very arbitrary and like 4 is a high number. Like I'm going a little outside the plausibility range here.
You're saying 4 of the list that we say won't exist may possibly have.
Correct. Yeah. So like if we assume 4 of them exist and we don't know which 4.
Like Romulus might have accidentally.
Maybe, right, or whatever. Maybe there was a Hercules because there was a lot of argument over in antiquity about whether he existed and did that allow certain inheritance claims and so, like a lot of stuff went on.
Gotcha.
So anyway, like maybe he did, whatever. But so anyway, the most you could claim is 4. Like if you claim more than 4, you're starting to be ridiculous, right? Like 4 is already being a little ridiculous. But so I said, I'm going to set my uncertainty, like I'm going to acknowledge my level of uncertainty is at 4. So that's 4 out of 14. So we've got 0 out of 14 on the bottom, 4 out of 14 on the top, and it's somewhere in there. And so the top is 4 out of 14, right? So that was what I set at. Now there's a little equation you can run called Laplace's rule of succession. That's how you do the math here. It comes to close to what you think it would given the numbers I've already stated, but that's the technical aspect that we might talk about at the end. So you do the math, and Gregor understands this, and they do this as well. And so the only way that you can respond to this, and this most responses to this have been completely apologetical and dumb, right? They're trying to get Jesus out of the set. You can't do that. That's just dishonest. Like he's obviously in the set, or they try to claim the set doesn't exist.
But Gregor's not doing that.
No, exactly. Right. Well, this is what I'm saying. Is the usual critiques are these dumb sort of where they're completely dismissing what's going on here, right? Just not even engaging with the argument at all. And so they make up these things. They'll say, "Oh, the set doesn't exist," or whatever, right? And so that's what they'll try to do. But no, the Gregor team is the first time anyone took the argument seriously and realized that the only way you could change the result is to get more people in, right? Or to show that some of the 14 were historical, because that would change the bottom margin, because the bottom margin is sitting at 0. If they could get some of those, prove them historical, what you do is narrow the margins of error, right? Which is good. That would be progress. We want that, right? That's the sort of thing we want. And so what they do is they try to get in extra people, and they actually kind of force in a ton of historical people. And for those who want to see some graphical representations of this, Aaron Adair ran some statistics to show that they're kind of forcing in historical people, trying to like basically, overload the set. But in the non-mathematical sense, what's going on here is they're taking the criteria and interpreting them so broadly that just about anybody fits in the set.
And that's without getting into the weeds, but I'd love to see a deep dive at some point where you went individually through each of these as they try to bring.
Well, there are some examples I talk about. I don't go through every single one. Of course. There's some examples I talk about in the book. So if you want to see examples of what I'm talking about, I give examples in there, like things where they're way over and sometimes some of their scores are wrong, like they're scoring people for having no wars when they did have wars and things like this. So there's problems in there. But they also do some other things where they rescore some of the 14, and they might be right about that. So there might be useful for people who want to get the scores exactly right. There's some useful stuff in there. They might be right or not. You could check where they rescore them, but the rescores don't drop them out of the set, so it doesn't affect.
They're just being very
right. It doesn't affect my argument. But they're doing useful work is my point. It's not a completely useless paper. And the thing is, after they're doing all this, so the most of the 33 or whatever don't belong in the set, because they're putting very mundane people in. They're not using the criteria as criteria of heavy mythologization. So the more fantastical interpretation of the criteria is what you're supposed to be doing.
If I may, just as you're going into this, do you happen to have an idea of how many points you would say based on their broad criteria average that you would have to drop off that don't check the boxes? So for example, if they popped in, let's just say an ancient philosopher we know existed that they put in, but based on the broad criteria, when you go back through, you're like, no, there's like 4 or 5 points that don't even attribute to this guy. He's no longer a 12, he's a 7, or he's a 6, or whatever it might be. Do you find that's kind of what we're saying here?
Yeah, it's like, and this is the example I gave on the live stream, but like saying that Aristotle went away to boarding school counts as losing your parents and having a foster parent, right? Like it's like that's not like if you count in going away to boarding school where you still have your parents are still same parents and they're still around, you don't have foster parents or anything like that. You're just letting anybody in. Like you're not talking about mythology anymore. You're just trying to force people in by over interpreting the criteria to make anything fit, right? So you can't do that. That's kind of cheating in a way. What we're looking for, we got to be looking for heavily mythologized characters, not mundane, mildly mythologized characters.
Got it. And 12 and up heavily.
12, yeah, that was what my estimate was, 12 and up. Like you could dicker around that. Like if you were to try and move the number up to 13 or 14 or something, it might not really change the math very much. It's just so it's better to have more members to be more sure, right? So like if you can get 14 in, that's it. When you do 12 and above, you get 14 in. If you can do that, that gives you like enough of a base. And if none of them are historical, that tells you that you're onto something, right? Like being that you've found the right marker, right? Because it's very indicative, because there should be like as many historical people in that. If it was a random set and didn't have any predictive power, the number of people in that set should be the same. Like the frequency should be the same as in all other literature, right? Like, so the number of historical people should be mostly historical people, because most people who claim to did exist, right? So like the number of mythical people is very small, the number of historical people is much, much larger. So if you're just randomly setting criteria, there should be tons of historical people in the set. When you set the criteria and like you get 14 people, none of them are historical, well, that tells you that can't happen by chance, right? So that tells you this is definitely indicative of mythology that we're looking.
In a nutshell, for me, I'm thinking, what a practical joke. If Jesus was meant, if there was really a dude and then y'all did this to him, again, my point about Lucian, you asshats, you literally have destroyed any chance getting to know the real guy.
Yeah.
And so if there was a guy, this is all a practical joke.
Correct. If there was a guy, and by heavily mythologizing like this, you've basically erased his historicity. Yeah. Unless you preserve other evidence of his historicity, right, which we have, like for Apollonius of Tyana. I give examples.
Got it. Sorry.
I go into him in detail in the book. He's the one that scholars will admit that he might not have existed. So like he's just barely above 50% on historicity. So we can count him as historical, but it's weak. Like he's challengeable. Alexander the Great is not challengeable, and Mithradates is not as well attested as Alexander, but pretty well, like way better than Apollonius, right? So this is what happened. So they tried to get the total to be way more than 14, you know, throwing in 30, whatever. But most of those are fraudulent. They're not supposed to be in the set because they're not heavily mythologized. They're trying to force them in. But the three of the people that they have on that list do fit the heavy mythologization interpretation of the criteria. And they do convince me that I was wrong in the original study to exclude those three guys that we mentioned earlier. And so that they're right. Like you can show like, oh yeah, they actually do. They fit the heavy mythologization interpretation of the criteria and they fit enough of them. They should be in the set.
Dr. Carrier does change his mind.
Yeah.
He's going,
yeah, this is the way to do it, right? Is to show me evidence. Like don't just engage in a bunch of specious rhetoric and apologetics.
Right.
No, actually engage with the argument and give me evidence. So you give me evidence, you're like, yeah, okay, yeah, you've done it, right? And so now, so they've added 3. So now we had 14. My set was 14. Now there's 17.
Got it.
So now my original 0 out of 14 is now, the bottom we're talking, is now 3 out of 17. Right? You see what I'm saying?
Rehistorical.
Because we can't say all 17 didn't exist because 3 of those guys are solid, you know, enough to say that they're historical.
Right.
So the 0 is out. It's got to be 3 at the bottom, but it's not 3 out of 14 now because they didn't show any of the 14 people are historical. What they did is they added people that were historical, right? So this has a particular arithmetical effect that's going to be surprising and counterintuitive when we get to the end. But anyway, so now my bottom margin is 3 out of 17, right? The upper margin, I had already said there's going to be 4. They found 3. So in fact, they're under me, right? I actually overestimated compared to them how many would be historical. So they're actually saying there's fewer historical people on the upper end than I did, right? So I said, so I stick with my 4. So my top margin is still 4, but it's 4 out of 17 now, not 4 out of 14.
Got it.
Right? And so if you run the math, you do the Laplace's rule of succession and all that stuff, you have this ironic effect that the top margin drops now because of their work. It drops from 1 in 3 to 1 in 4. So the odds for Jesus, the prior odds on Jesus existing went down.
Yeah. Right? What did he get? We're going to get into this map because it would be intuitive, right? If you added in our mind, we think if you just add more people that are on the opposite conclusion that we know existed, you would think that this would somehow make it more likely if we found 3, why can't we put Jesus?
And I love this because it's very much like the Monty Hall problem and these other things where you're like, that can't be right. And then you like do the math and you're like, fuck, it is right. Okay. And it's the reason is because intuitively we're still stuck on the number 14. Right. So like if they had shown Hercules and Romulus and Theseus were historical, the effect would be completely different because then they're showing that some of the 14 were historical, right?
And you add 3.
And and if they added 3 historical, right. That would radically like hugely change everything. But that's not what they did. They added 3. So this is the game for people who think they can do math and they're want clever math puzzles and they can see the eureka moment.
Yeah.
Think to yourself, which is higher, 4 out of 14 or 4 out of 17? Right. So the audience can think to themselves, like, if you went from 4 out of 14 to 4 out of 17, have you gone down?
Right. You have gone
down. Yeah, right. So that's why that happened. Now, the effect of what they did shows mostly on the bottom margin, but the problem is that no one cares about the bottom margin. So like intuitively people are ignoring that, but they've hugely improved the bottom margin. So we went from 0 out of 14 to 3 out of 17. That's a huge increase, right? So we've gone up, not down, but we went up on the bottom margin, which is the margin no one cares about, right? So so it did have the effect that your intuition expects. It just had it in the side of the equation that you don't care about, right? So like if you confuse the two, that's how your intuition can get it wrong. So there's a variety of ways that the intuition can go wrong here, but if you do the math, it shows it perfectly.
Kind of wanted to ask, first of all, before we move into a different question I have, is that your point is they added 3. Now, they won't agree with your assessment on saying, well, we only added 3. They still are persuaded that they've added all the other historical people. So what is the next step for that in terms of you're not going to see eye to eye? You've already in your upcoming book discussed this, but like, in a sense, you're critiquing their broadening of the categories to such a degree. Yeah. If that were the case, I guess they're also disagreeing with Rank-Raglan. They're disagreeing with these guys too, right?
I don't know if I'd frame it that way. So like how auto rank and how Raglan, how they would respond to this, we can't predict that. And that's getting into historiography that has nothing to do with what we're talking
Okay.
about. So I wouldn't frame it that way. I wouldn't say whether or not Rank-Raglan or Dundas, who is actually my source on this, because Dundas is the one who incorporates Jesus, and he's the one who actually created the model that I use in the so it's really Alan Dundas. But how they would react, I mean, they're all deceased now, so we can't.
Of course, I'm not.
So yeah, so like leave it out of that. But so another way to look at it is that what Gregor and everybody did is they created a legitimate other set, right? So you can have a superset. I'm talking about the subset, right? So they're talking about the superset. The superset exists, like that's truly an actual
Mythologized
set.
historical.
Yeah, right. And it's and in fact, in that superset, most people are historical because there's a lot of mundane people thrown in there. But I'm talking about the highly mythologized subset, right? The set inside that one. And that set's also real, and it also exists, and it's also inside that set. And when you look at that set, well, that you can't get in all those other people. The subset is smaller than the superset, right? Yeah. And that's the one that predicts a low chance of historicity. Not a zero chance, but a lower chance.
The subset and the superset that you're talking about, too, what I've noticed is a lot of the people that I heard them kind of list in the superset are actually modeled after the subset type archetypes. So like a lot of these heroes.
That's also true. Yeah, like
I'm not saying all of them.
Some of the ideas get filtered in, but that by itself is not a problem because
No, I know.
Because like let's say that Gregor and gang were able to show show that like 30 people were just like Alexander, heavily mythologized. And they were through that same process. It's like people want to emulate the stories of mythic heroes, throw them on top of historical people. Yeah. That would be completely legit, and then we would have to change the subset. The heavy mythologized subset would be much larger. It'd be like 30 people, most of them historical, and Gregor, et cetera, would have accomplished what they were going to do, right? Then they'd be correct, and I would agree with them. But they didn't do that. They didn't show that those extra people belong in the subset of heavily mythologized.
Yeah, I'm just saying
they do belong in this superset of mildly mythologized people.
And that mythologizing, though, often, not always, that I found, has this imitation in ways that reflect like, oh, they're trying to look like Dionysus, or they're trying to look like Harry.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's some of them are chance accident correlations, but
of course.
But some of them are deliberate, like they're taking historical person and they're layering things on top. Right. And like for Apollonius, that's obvious, right? And same with Alexander.
You can add in like Proteus Peregrinus, who we think really was this philosopher.
Yeah,
I know it takes Heracles and John.
We don't have enough criteria we don't have enough about him to actually answer that question, whether he was being pushed into that set or not.
Yeah.
But the process certainly existed and is what we're trying to look for, right? We're trying to find out in the subset, not their superset, but the subset of heavily mythologized people, how many of those people had that happen to them? Because it's very unlikely that anybody in the subset will have had that happen to them by accident. That like the only way Alexander the Great can belong to the set is there were deliberate lifts from the mythology onto Alexander.
Yeah.
So they're deliberately emulating these mythotypes and stuff and deliberately layering them on him. That's really the only way you get in the set as a historical person. And so that's not a problem for my view, and that's not a problem for Gregor's view. Like we all agree that that's how it has to happen, right? So the only question is, has it happened or how often? This is the question. The question isn't whether it happened. The question is how often. Like we all agree it happened or could have happened or whatever. The question is how often did it happen? And then how often could it have happened, right? That's the question we're getting at. And that means you have to get to that subset and look in that subset and ask, okay, how many of these guys turned out to be historical? And so now I think this is the update that changes my conclusion from the original book now to the new book, which is that it went from 14 to 17. So the upper margin went from 1.3 to 1.4. Now, and the lower margin went up much larger. So, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's like a lot. It went up a lot more. So it narrowed the margins. So my original study created these tolerances for the argument that I said it's going to be between these two values. And so what Gregor and team did successfully is show that I was right, that the correct margins of error is inside the margins that I set. And all they did is show that we can shrink those margins. They're actually smaller than I thought.
What if someone tries to push back? Okay, I'm not a math guy. In high school I was, but there's too many formulations. I'd have to relearn how the rules and operations work.
Yeah.
But what if someone said, no, you start with like 4 out of the whole set, right? You stuck to this 4 thing. But like now that we know that 3 of them are historical, why don't we add more to, since we have 17?
Why don't we make it 7?
Why don't we make it 7? Or
Yeah,
why
yeah.
don't we make it more?
I talk about this in the book. So like if you want to see what happens when you tinker that way, that would not be a correct way of doing it because I didn't have 4. I just said there would be 4.
Right.
Like that was make this very explicit. We looks like 0. Like in plain fact, it's 0.
Of course, because you only have
So
0.
I'm just going to invent 4. I'm just going to say that 4 of the 14 are historical. I just, like let's just assume.
Chance.
Yeah, right. Like we don't have any evidence that there's 4. We don't have anything, but I'm just going to say it, right? And that set my top margin, which measures my uncertainty. Like how uncertain do I think I can be about this? And so what they did is they found 3. So I predicted 4, they found only 3. So they're under me, they're not above me. We don't add them together, right? I said 4, that's including the 3 they found, right? Because I said there's gonna be 4, right? So that's the only thing that they change is they change it from 14 to 17 total members.
Okay.
And so that's what skews the math a little bit, but the math still works out the way I'm doing it. But no, you wouldn't add them. You wouldn't add them on top of each other.
Because that's kind of a thing. You're just, by chance. You don't add an additional 3 more.
Yeah. So you got to think of it as like, I predicted 4, right?
Right.
So the question is, so they come along and they show, you know what? You were 1 off. It's 3, right? Like that's what they came out with, right? Essentially. So yeah, that's why you wouldn't add them together.
How many of the?
But I do the math, by the way, if you added them together, and it's also interesting to see that. But
how many of the characters that didn't make it into the subset were close, in your opinion, that you can recall?
There weren't many. In fact, none that I can think of were close enough to even, like, Apollonius is close to not being in the set, but he's solidly in the set. So like, so this is one thing where Aaron Adair did the statistics where you saw there were the 2 peaks.
Right. It was going over my head.
Yeah, right, yeah. So Aaron Adair, we can see this in the live stream that we're talking about, but Aaron Adair did a statistical analysis and shows that there's actually, it's a multimodal, it's not a bell curve. And there's a huge bump here and a huge bump here. This bump is full of historical people, and this bump is full of mythical people.
That bump's always smaller.
Well, also, yeah, but the thing is like that means that this bump is way over here and not over here. It means that pretty much basically all the historical people they pushed in only barely belong, right? Like, because they're kind of being forced into the set by like trying to stretch criteria and trying to get them to fit. And so like the heavy hitters, if you go look at that, the high scorers, this is why, like, if you were to change the criteria to say like you got to be 14 or higher or something like that, the number of historical people in the set shrinks. Like the higher you go, that like, right.
Like you would still then only have a subset, but it'd be like a strengthened older.
Right. It's like boiling it down, and all you're getting left are mythical people.
Okay, and wouldn't that be that some mythical people might actually be off the list too? Then I mean,
yes, absolutely. Okay. And in fact, I talk about this in the book because there's the Gregor team thinks that maybe Joseph should be kicked out of the set. I show they're wrong for just straightforward reasons of interpreting the facts and so forth. But they also rescore him, and I rescore him, and I realized like I had him scored wrong. I was relying on Dundas and Raglan and so on. But they challenged some of those scorings. I go back, do my own reanalysis and find that if you rescore him, he's still in it, but he's only a 12. He's just barely in it, right? So he's the first one to drop off if you were to move your limitation higher, if you were to move your barrier higher, requirement level, right? So yeah, some of the mythical people do fall down the tail of the bell curve on the mythical side, and that's true. But I think once you're at 12, you're already really mythologized. That's why it's more important. It's less important to ask whether they fit the criteria. It's more important to ask which version of the criteria do they hit. And this is the key. This is really the most important thing, because it's when you say like just freaking any possible being away from your parents counts as having foster parents, right, then you're including a ton of people that don't belong, right? You've dumped the whole genre. You're not looking at the mytho genre at all. You're not looking at heavy mythologization. You're just looking for excuses to pump people into the set, right? Like you're not really using the criteria correctly. So you got to use it. It's got to be like fostering, right? It's got to be something close to like one of their parents is missing somehow, right? Like, because that's the criteria that the mythotype has. And certainly the subgenre, if you want to say there's a broader mythotype that lacks that, that's fine.
Yeah.
That could also be true, but we're only interested in the heavy mythologization set. We're only interested in the subset. And there's a lot of criteria where they do that, where they're very stretch the criteria to include all kinds of things that don't belong. So they're using the wrong interpretation of the criteria, essentially. They're using an interpretation that is not looking for mythical people. It's looking for historical people and trying to fit them in. Whereas what we want to see is we want to see the heavy mythologized set so that we can see how many of those people are historical. That's the question we want to answer. So we don't want to try and get historical people into the set arbitrarily. What we want to do is we want to look at the heavily mythologized guys and then see, okay, how many historical people got into that set? Like, that's what we want to know. And they're kind of like trying to avoid learning the answer to that question. They want to try and get rid of the question by broadening the set so much that we're not even looking at the heavily mythologized set anymore. We're looking at this other set that has nothing to do with the question.
Yeah.
And you could say, like, well, all those mundane guys like fit in the set when you do this. But Jesus doesn't meet the criteria according to those mundane senses of the term. He meets it in the fantastical sense. So he's in the fantastical set, right? You can't say, like, if we had it, like, if Jesus was like the other guys, let's say Aristotle, it's like Jesus was like Aristotle, like he hits all the criteria in the same way that Aristotle did, then Jesus wouldn't be a heavily mythologized character, right? Then he would be a mundane person, and then we would be talking correctly. We'd say, oh, well, then he's the mundane set mostly historical. I agreed with that from the beginning.
Yeah.
And then we would have a different prior probability for Jesus. But the thing is that Jesus is not in that set. He's in the heavily mythologized
And that's
set.
the problem.
Right, yeah. So, like, that's why you got to look at the heavy mythologized stuff. You can't pretend that Jesus is a mundane character like Aristotle. He's not. And so that's how you got to do it that way. And I use examples. I use the John Wick righteous mass killer at their type to try and show this.
Cool example.
Yeah. It's like you get these movie mass killers narratives. None of them were historical.
And none of them are identical. That's the
thing. Yeah. Wildly divergent. Yeah. That also is a good way that teaches how tropes work.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but also the point of that is that you would immediately recognize that it was illegitimate if you were to say, well, we'll just put any mass murderer into this set by wildly, openly interpreting the criteria. So they say, like, well, we'll just say a nation can count as a loved one, therefore, white nationalist mass murderers get sucked into the set, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not following the genre. You're trying to force people in the set that don't belong there, because all those righteous mass killers are not nationalists. They're not. The loved one is not a nation. That's the point of the genre, is that it is a loved one. Like, someone is captured that they have to rescue, or killed that they have to avenge, and that's the trope, right?
That trope's rules, then
you're not looking at the genre anymore.
But even if someone, let's say along the way, broke the genre's rules and was writing something, you shouldn't then stretch the whole standard model of the trope to match. If you found one anomalous, example where someone did use the trope, but made it general for a nation or some crazy thing, that does not change the rules.
Yeah, and it will say that exactly. So they would not count for that one, but they might count for the other criteria, so they might still get into the set, right? So that's why you can play around. That's why creative mythographers, creative fiction writers can play around with these tropes and come up with things that don't fit some criteria that fit others.
Yeah.
But you can still look at that and say, this is not accidental. They're definitely emulating or satirizing the trope, right? So that this is on genre,
right?
And so that's how you tell the difference between, like, trying to force people into the set versus correctly looking for the genre, because it's the genre you want to look at, because you want to know if someone's in that genre, how often are they historical? That's the question you want to know. You don't want to know whether you can squeeze people in by wildly stretching the criteria to be in, right? Like, that's not the question you should be asking. So anyway, that's how the paper goes wrong, but how it goes right is in getting those three guys back in where those guys do meet the heavy mythologization set. So there's progress being made, and it was the first paper that actually engaged with my argument correctly and is actually doing the right thing. It just made some mistakes in implementation, but you can still sift through that and get some positive data that changes the results. And so that's what shows up in my new book.
Okay, so the one hiccup, I brought this up in my live stream. I've mentioned to you in private message, just saying, the thing they did that really made me, after listening to for 5 hours, reading the article and getting my head wrapped around this, that made me go, wow, this almost sounds definite that Jesus existed based on this criteria, was how they explained that the myth that these people who are heavily mythologized, by the way, they kind of do use, it's strange, because your point about how they are trying to put all these historical people into the heavily mythologized, they still categorize them as two separate groups in a way. And what they do is they still go, well, we have historical, and they go, notice that all the heavily mythologized are back here in the Bronze Age. So what
That's a separate paper, but yes.
yeah, but it's still relatable to this whole thing. And what you said that really dawned on me, and I want you to explain this for the audience, because I think there are many out there that are like me who saw this and went, okay, not only should we add more to the list, which kind of confuses how do we deal with numbers now, but then you also have to factor in that like only heavily mythologized people are back here. If you factor in their model, right, all back Bronze Age, very early, only Romulus might check off the 6th century, only in the whole box of things. So they add Romulus onto this side, and they say, look at all these historical people. They're all written contemporaneous, which is a big argument that they wouldn't make up a guy that's contemporaneous. And I know that you have used examples later, John, from all these different people, but I want to paint this narrative, what you did that made me kind of go, hold on, stop, don't just buy that. Here's why. Is that the Christian mythology is building off Daniel. And when you can't just go, well, Jesus must therefore be at the Trojan War.
Right, yeah.
You can't force him into
You
this
can
model.
predict to 100% certainty that they're not going to date Jesus to the Trojan War, right? Because that's not salient to them. Like, that's not relevant. The better way to frame this is that the mistake they make in that paper is that they think that dramatic date is somehow predictive in some sort of abstract, or some sort of, what I should say, objective sense. Like somehow 1100 BC is objectively relevant to this. And that's not. The correct thing is what's happening in all these cases is that heroes are being placed at foundings. Right? These are all founding myths, right? So these are etiological myths, myths that explain a certain institution, a certain religion, a certain city, a certain nation, etc. So they're founding myths. So this 100% dictates that you have to place the dramatic date at the founding. You can't move it to any other date. You're forced. By the very logic of this, your mythic hero has to be at the founding. So what happened with Hellenism when you had the rise of, well, the whole concept of Hellenism, where the disparate Greek groups, city-states, and things started to see themselves as a common people, like the Greeks, right? There's this idea of Hellenism as a thing. When that grew up, a lot of what happened is all these heroes, when they got historicized, they got pushed to the same founding myth, because the Trojan War was held as kind of the founding myth of Hellenism. It's the first time when all the Greeks unite, mythically united, maybe even historically, it could even be a real thing, but they mythically united to, defeat an enemy. And that to them was the founding myth for Hellenism, this idea of unified Greece. And so all the heroes get pushed to that founding. So that's why it's all Trojan War, right? That's all the heroes.
Here have Jesus there.
Now look at the Jewish ones, Moses, Abraham, etc. They're all pushed to the patriarchal era because that's the founding, right?
Yeah.
So they have to be there. You can't put Moses in 2nd century BC. That wouldn't make any sense.
Even if he was invented in the 3rd or 4th.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Even if the whole story was invented in the 3rd, the whole idea is the founding myth needs to be Pharaonic age, needs to be that era, because that's the whole logic that, when Israel was conquered, yada, yada, you've got to have like the whole storyline from Abraham to Joshua. You've got to have that has to be your founding myth. They got to fit in there in some sort of chronology. You're forced. As soon as you've decided what your founding is, you have to put them there. And the same with Romulus. Why is Romulus? He was probably invented around the 3rd century. Why was he put in the 7th century or whatever? It's because that's when they believed, according to myth, that Rome was founded, and he's a founding myth he's the founder of Rome. So
according to Joseph A.P. Wilson, which I don't know the source off the top, there's one example in all of the history he could find where he also gets placed back here in the Trojan just because Rome's trying to come.
That would be a good example of an attempt to rope Rome into Hellenism.
Exactly.
That didn't take. The Romans really like their version.
Of course.
But nonetheless, point being is he's putting at the founding, right? So it's not that you have to put a dramatic date hundreds of years ago. It's that if your foundation is hundreds of years ago, you have to put your dramatic date there. You don't have a choice, right?
Exactly.
So when you look at the Christians, well, what happens then? They're explaining the founding of their religion. Well, when did their religion start? 30s AD. So you have to put your hero at 30s AD. You can't put him before. You can't put him after. Like, you have no way to move him around. It would make no sense to put him into the Trojan War or the patriarchal era. That doesn't make any sense, because that doesn't explain why your religion began in the 30s AD. Like, this is an etiological myth, the founding myth. It has to be dramatic date of the 30s. Now, you could also say, well, maybe it would fit in the 70s BC, etc., like the right chronology, high chronology stuff. But that's still the same logic. So, like, even the Christians who are putting Jesus in the 70s BC, obviously they believed the religion began in the 70s BC, so that's why they moved him to that date, right? They're trying to move him to what they believe is the founding of the religion. And you could also point out that Jesus also has existed since the founding of time because, he's literally a pre-existent being and so forth. But the founding myth is when he came to start this new religion. That's the founding myth. So it has to start there. You mentioned Daniel, and that kind of like caused the flurry to try and create new versions of Judaism to reflect the coming of the Messiah, as they thought it was predicted.
There was like Daniel timetable.
Yeah, right, exactly. The Dead Sea Scrolls, they're trying to figure out the timetable, etc.
It kind of
Christianity.
You say it forces their hand.
In history. You can show that it has to be first BC or first AD. Like there's no math you can do for Daniel that gets it to be any other era.
So the can kick down the road, and they're first.
Christianity is one of these sects that we're all trying to find a Danielic timetable to land it. And for whatever reason, they landed in 30s, we think 30s AD, and then that's when the religion began. There could be all kinds of contingent reasons why that is, but it's not relevant to the etiological myth. It's that once it happened, once this finally took, we started this religion in 30s AD, it's still around 40 years later, which is important. So now they have to explain the founding of this thing that's still around, right, this religion. So what do? They put the dramatic date into the 30s. And even with Paul, before there's any dramatic date at all, because there's no drama, there's no narrative of Jesus, right? It's just the celestial idea that they're finding in Scripture and Revelation and stuff. Even that's when the revelation started, is this has happened now. I incarnated and died now, so this has kicked off the end of the world. It's all happening now, right? So even then, it's the foundation. So it had to happen then. You can't push the crucifixion back to the Garden of Eden or whatever.
Right.
Because that's the whole logic of the religion, is that this has happened now. It's new. It's happening now. So the foundation myth is locked to the 30s because of when, really it would be Peter, when Peter had this revelation and started this religion, locks it to the 30s. And when you have to, 40 years later, when you have to tell a narrative about this Jesus, you've got to put him in the 30s. You don't have any choice. So this whole idea of dramatic date can't give you any predictive probability of being historical or mythical. It's irrelevant to this whole question of prior probability.
So a couple more as we get 8 minutes left, 7 minutes left here, and it's just really short, sweet, punchy. It's a categorical kind of error to try and force that you can't have a guy. You have to deal with the whole data in the Jewish milieu in order to see this. And the fact that you've got the pressure from Daniel, you've got the ideological origins here in the 1st century, you can't compare when they did it, because they're trying to create the distance between, all the heavily made up people clearly are way back here. They at least placed them way back here, but they didn't do this for him, therefore he doesn't fit in that category. But the other thing, because I think that's important, the other thing is this: are there other characters that you could point to that were somewhat in the ancient world, not just the modern cargo cults and stuff, where they place this fictional made-up character in the somewhat recent, because usually the apologetic of legend can't. This is another form of that, by the way. Legend can't develop that quick.
Yeah, that isn't, to be clear, that isn't the argument specifically that they make.
I'm just throwing in this.
If they did, they'd be wrong, and I disprove that on the historicity of Jesus, that the you can't have rapid legendary development is false.
Well, that's not what they're saying.
No, exactly. That is not what they're saying.
I'm trying to say this is a spin-off version in my mind, that it's not legendary rapid, it's inventing a mythical character. They use this argument to go, I don't know any other examples within 30, 40 years of the time of something. There are some people who might be still alive that they would have invented a whole cloth of character back in the ancient world.
Right.
Your example is cargo cults, but that's more contemporary.
Yeah. Luddites is another example.
Right. So any ancient world examples that we could go, or
of a recent hero?
Within 40 to 60 years, they likely
creating a mythical character. I can't think of one off the top of my head, because we only have one new founded religion, and that's Christianity. There's no other, what other institution was recently founded by a mythical person that you could look to? If there had been, if you take Mithraism, for example, Mithraism, what we call Mithraism, started around the same time as Christianity, but it didn't claim to have been founded then. It claimed to have been founded 3,000 years earlier with Zoroaster, etc., right? The other Mithras. He's deep time because that was their belief, is when it started, right? So the Mithraists were not thinking that they were starting some new thing that a new guy told them about. They're continuing an ancient religion. Right? So that's why Mithraism doesn't give us that example. But let's say hypothetically the Mithraists believed that Mithras came back and started a whole new version of this religion then yeah, they would have historically placed him in the 30s AD, roughly, or 20s or 30s, maybe 40s. We're not exactly sure when it began. There's I'm talking about the studies by Beck, who show that the Mithraism started later than most people thought before.
Right.
So there's debate between Ulanzi and Beck as to when Mithraism started, but Mithraism was selling itself as an ancient religion, not as a new one, right? So, but if it had thought it was a new religion, and if it said, yeah, Mithras came and did all these and defeated the bull like yesterday or whatever, right? Like if that was their teaching, then 40 years later they would be telling stories about a mythical Mithras set in the 40s AD or whatever, because that's when the founding was. That's when you have to put the date. But that didn't happen. Mithraism didn't start that way. So if you're looking for religions like Christianity, there aren't any. So we have no comparans. We can't find any. Yeah, we can't find it. But the relevance,
that as an example that
the relevant point is that the mistake happening here is confusing absolute date with relative date, right? So they're looking at absolute dates, like that somehow 1100 AD or BC is special for some reason. Like there's no reason for that. It's relative date, so it's relative to founding. So all of these, if you look at every single one is placed at founding. So that's the relative dating. And then they're misinterpreting that as somehow telling us that absolute dating is predictive, and it's absolutely not. The thing that's predictive is founding. That's the one thing that predicts all the dates for all these heroes. Whereas like 1100 BC is not predictive. You can't predict that someone will be placed there other than referring to the founding argument that they are going to be placed there because everybody believes that was the foundation of whatever. So the thing is, the dramatic date has no predictive capabilities here. So they're just looking at a mirage mathematically. It has nothing to do with the probability of Jesus being historical or not, because the dramatic date is entirely dictated by founding, and that's it. And that explains everything. And there's no data, there's no predictive value to that in terms of historicity at all, right? So like, obviously, you could say that about Apollonius as a historical person, or say Alexander the Great founded the sort of Eastern Hellenism, right? Like he went through and settled all these Greek colonies. So Hellenism outside of Greece into the Middle East. He's the founder of that. So if you were to make him up, you would have to put him at the Persian Wars, right? So you would put, but of course we know he's historical. So that's but that's even the historical people and Apollonius, etc. They're still the founding because that's the point of that. Like, historically founded something, and you do have Haile Selassie, even though he didn't found anything, but they believed he did. But that means Rastafarianism has to place their hero in the life of Rastafari, but we just happen to know that Rastafari is real. So anyways, it predicts everything, both historical and mythical. All the dramatic date placement is all based on founding, and therefore is non-predictive whether it's historical or not. Like that doesn't help us determine if something is historical or not.
Okay, well, look, we're going to get to the math now. So if you really want to see just a brief description of the math and how adding actually those three historical characters is actually more problematic for the probability of Jesus, here we are.
Okay, so let's imagine we've got the entire probability space. We've got 100% over here. We got 0% here. We got 50% in the middle, right? And so on my original study, I found the margin of error, which is the measure of my uncertainty, is that the prior odds, remember what we talked about earlier, is just the prior odds. The prior odds that someone like Jesus would be historical, I found were close to 0, right? Like the bottom end over here is close to 0.
Because you only had 14 of them.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to do it. It's 0 out of 14, because I had 14 members, 0 of them are historical. I'll show you the math on that later, but right now that's where I set it. And then the top margin was, 4 out of 14. And that comes to close to 33%. So this is my area of uncertainty. I know that the prior odds on Jesus or anyone else in that set being historical is somewhere in here, and that's my uncertainty, right? So that was my original result, right? And so what the Gregor study did is it increased the number to 17, right? And they moved the 0 to 3 because they proved 3 people are historical out of 17. They didn't prove any of the 14 historical. They only got 3 extra guys in. And then I said it could be 4. I predicted 4. They said 3, but I'm going to stick with 4 because I'm over guessing them by saying that my 4 prediction, I'm going to stay with my 4 prediction. And so my upper bound remains 4, and the lower bound now changed to 3. And so for those who look at this, you can tell that it's going down here. but it's going up here.
Right.
And so it's the margin of error falls more like in here now, right? So it's narrowed. So the result is actually correct, right? It's actually where I predicted it would be inside here. And so the Gregor study properly run gets the correct result. And all it does is it narrows the margin of error. Now, if we were to do this mathematically, let me see, can I can. Okay, so I'm gonna move this up. Move it up to here. So like so Laplace's, here's the thing. It's Laplace's rule of succession is S plus 1 over n plus 2. S is the number of cases, n is the total number. So if you were to do the 14, my original thing, so the original thing would be 14 plus 2, right, on the bottom and on the top. My bottom margin was 0 plus 1. So what we get here is 1 over 16. And that was so that's how you do the math from 0, right? Like 0 over 14, you can't do that, right? Like you can't put 14 into 0. What you use is this, and it gives you the predictive value. So given that there's 0 members of 14, you can predict that the bottom odds of someone being historical is going to be around 1/16. And this is Laplace's rule. It's well used in mathematics to do exactly the kind of thing that I'm doing. It's a predictive measure. It's just the top odds, the best prediction we can make is that 1 out of 16 will be that. And so that was my bottom margin. You could do the math and figure out what that is decimally. I don't think we need to do that. Now look at the upper margin, right? So you look at the upper margin is, again, it's S plus 1. Sorry. It's messy. S plus 1 over n plus 2. But we're going to do it now with the new numbers. So we've got, for the bottom margin, we have 3 plus 1, because we have the 3 guys that are historical, over, now it's 17 plus 2, right? So now what we get out of this is 4 over 19. So you can compare, it's gone from 1/16 up to 4/19. And you can figure out, like, you can do some reduction and stuff to figure out where that roughly is. But you can see it's gone up. So the bottom margin has gone from here to here. And this is close to 1 and 5, right? It's roughly, not exactly, but it's close. So it's gone from 1 and 16 to 1 and 5. That's a big improvement, right? The bottom odds have gone up significantly. But the thing is no one cares about the bottom odds. So no one wants to know what the lowest probability is for Jesus existing. They want to know what the highest probability is. And so this is what's happened here. So here's S plus 1 over n plus 2. And we're going to do it with the new. So I've got my number 4. It's still higher than their 3. So the best bet is there's 4 still. It hasn't changed. Plus 1 over, now they've made there to be 17 members plus 2. So what have we got? We've got 5 now over 19. And you can see that's roughly 1 over 4. Roughly, not exactly, but close. So you see so we've gone from this. So now our margin of error, if we build the table again, 0, 100, 50. What we've gone is we've got about 1 and 5 to 1 and 4. So 1 and 5. Actually, let me do this. Yes, love this. 1 and 5 to 1 and 4 is the new margin of error, right? So that's what's changed, and that's what happens. And so anyway, for people who are wondering why adding historical people reduces the higher odds, it's because of this, that I already predicted 4 and they've created 17. So they've increased the number of people, but haven't increased the top number of people that could be historical.
The only way to prove that would be really finding more people that
more of the 17, right? Yeah, you need more. You need this number to go up. In fact, you need it. I can't remember exactly. I think. Okay, hang on, come on. There we go. I think, if I remember correctly, it needs to be higher than 6, maybe? I can't remember exactly. I think it needs to be at least 6, maybe 7. So let's find out. So if we did this, so let's get this out of here. If we did it like this, then we would have 7 over 19. So what does that work out to? That's roughly, that's almost 1 and 3. So that's not getting you very far, right? So you really need like 7. So let's see what 7 is. 7, that would be 8 over 19. That's almost, It's just below 1/2. So it's just below 50%, right?
Right.
So you see what I'm saying is like the
You just gotta
number
keep
of
adding
people.
more.
Yeah. So if they want the prior probability to be above 50%, I think they need at least 8 members out of the 17 to be proven historical. And if it's 8, let's see, it would be, so it would be 9/19. No, even that doesn't do it, right? So that doesn't get you. You need, you need 9, 10. You need 10.
Which would put you over.
Or 8. I'm sorry. You need 8. No, 9. You need 9. 9 gets you 10 out of 19. So that gets you over the middle, right?
Yeah,
That gets you
yeah.
above 50%. So you would, and that means to get 10, you would need a 9 here. So this needs to be 9. You need 9 people. Oh, come on, pen. There we go. You would need this to be 9.
Got it.
So to change that. So that's how that works, essentially. And so people are interested in the math is actually quite simple once you understand it.
Yeah.
This is not calculus. It's pretty easy. But it does come down to how many people of that set can you prove are historical. And the set has to be heavily mythologized people because that's the only set you're interested in.
Yeah.
You're not interested in mundanely or mildly mythologized people.
Right.
So that's it.
Thank you.